Farmers in Europe are revolting against climate agendas that are crushing their livelihoods. Why do governments want to make it harder to feed people? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Europe is on fire. Farmers everywhere have mobilized and have disrupted everyday life with massive protests. They're going to need to add another verse to Old MacDonald because on his farm, he has a brick, E-I-E-I, oh God, he's chucking it.
The heart of Brussels turned into a battleground. On one side, farmers and protesters here to demand change. On the other, riot police. The sky full of acrid smoke from burning tyres.
Tractors barricading highways, manure dumped at government buildings, tires on fire from France to Brussels to Greece to Portugal. Farmers erupting in protests across the continent.
Giant piles of manure in front of government buildings? Weird. Usually they work inside of them. Farmers' protests in Europe are nothing new, and last year saw its fair share in the Netherlands, Germany, and Eastern European countries. But recently things have gotten out of hand in Europe. All these locations you see here are protests that have happened this year alone, and it's just the beginning of February. Things got especially bad in France, when hundreds of farmers on tractors laid siege around Paris earlier this year. And since this was France, they think their protests were more refined and exceptional than anyone else's, even though they're basically the same but just used way more butter and cologne. Brussels, the de facto capital of the European Union, also had its fair share of protesters. Farmers from all over Europe, from countries such as Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, and Greece, came together to protest and make demands last week. At least 1,300 tractors clogged streets in Brussels near European Union institutions. I'm surprised tractors are the farm equipment being used for protesting because grabbing the pitchfork has always been such a go-to classic. Many protesters have clashed with local police and sprayed the streets and buildings with manure. So what exactly were they protesting over? One of the big ticket issues is cheap food imports. Eastern European farmers in particular have issues with cheap Ukrainian food imports after the European Union suspended import duties, quotas, and trade defense measures to help the Ukrainian economy. They're trying to help the Ukrainian economy by hurting their own economies. This is like how Captain Marvel, instead of just, making an interesting, powerful female character, they tried propping her up by making Nick Fury look stupid by comparison. Are MCU writers running the EU? Additionally, there are also concerns about a pending trade agreement with Mercosur, Latin America's largest trading bloc consisting of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. That agreement will lower tariffs on Mercosur agricultural imports. And these kinds of food import agreements worry farmers because they're afraid that cheap food imports will drive them out of business. And this isn't just a matter of greed. Farmers are already struggling to make a living from their profession thanks to lower and lower returns. In 11 EU countries, prices paid to farmers fell by more than 10% from 2022 to 2023. Old MacDonald had a farm, and on this farm he had a lien against his property. E-I-E-I, oh God, what am I going to do? It also doesn't help that natural disasters and disease have put farmers in a serious bind. Even without those issues, things like fuel and fertilizer have been making food production more and more expensive ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Wait, if fertilizer is more expensive, why are they protesting with manure? That'd be like fishermen protesting by chucking caviar. All this is connected to the heart of European farmers' woes: European leaders' obsession with bureaucratic regulations. European regulators are so notorious that European farmers are put at a disadvantage, especially when other countries don't have to follow nearly as many costly and complex regulations, making imports much cheaper.
After 5 years of a lot of legislation, every single month we have a new one from the European Commission, and this should stop. We cannot accept more laws, even when the third countries, they don't respect the same rules that EU farmers. That's a real point.
Il faut que l'État comprenne qu'on n'en peut plus. Les agriculteurs n'en peuvent plus. On est à bout, on est sec en trésorerie, on n'a pas d'argent pour repartir. On a trop de normes environnementales. À un moment donné, ça suffit.
I get it. Imagine you're playing football, but you have to follow different rules than the other team. For you, touchdowns are only worth 1 point, there are no field goals, and the other team only has to touch you for a down. Don't think you'll be making the playoffs anytime soon. In response to these frustrations, European leaders have responded with some concessions. France, for example, announced millions of euros in aid, tax breaks, and a promise not to ban pesticides in France that are allowed elsewhere in Europe. And because this is France, I'm sure those pesticides will be extra buttery. Kill the pests with heart disease. The European Commission, meanwhile, delayed plans that would require farmers to leave more of their land fallow, meaning not planting anything in it for a season. Instead, it allows farmers to use some land that had been forced to lie fallow to grow certain crops, such as lentils and peas. European leaders also announced plans to shield farmers from cheap Ukrainian imports, driving prices down. They also said they wouldn't approve a trade deal with Mercosur unless imports meet the same regulatory standards that EU farmers face. Now, a lot of this sounds like kicking the can down the road, because it is. Things wouldn't have gotten nearly as bad as they are now if it weren't for European leaders letting their obsession with the supreme boogeyman, climate change, screw over the people who feed them. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. European farmers are mad, and for good reason. Many feel like the current system in Europe makes a mockery of both farmers and consumers. Why would they feel that way? Simple. European leaders have made farmers the scapegoats for climate change through their green policies. Yes, farmers. I don't know if I've ever seen a more literal example of biting the hand that feeds. European leaders like European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have long championed reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 through an ambitious European Green Deal. The deal aims to introduce measures including a tax on carbon, pesticide bans, nitrogen emission curbs, and restrictions on water and land usage. It's pretty obvious that these policies focus a lot of attention on farmers and force them to make sacrifices in the name of climate action. But that's okay. I mean, it's not like farmers need water and land to grow produce. Everyone knows vegetables just magically appear in supermarkets all by themselves, the same way my laundry does itself every time I visit my mom. Climate activists like Greenpeace have long advocated for governments to gut farming after claiming that farms are far worse for the climate than cars. So instead of farming, we could just start eating cars now. If you thought corn was bad for your digestion, wait until you try a Kia. So European politicians have basically taken these kinds of warnings as go-aheads for making life hell for farmers. One of the ways they've been doing that is by asking farmers to reduce livestock, relocate, or shut down. The Netherlands, a major beef exporter, was recently really into this when it planned to buy and close thousands of farms to meet climate goals, all with the EU's approval. This really didn't sit well with Dutch farmers because, surprise, surprise, these kinds of policies make life for farmers more difficult. It's almost as if European leaders hate farmers for doing their job, feeding people. Look, I've had some mediocre hamburgers in my life, but I've never thought, I must destroy this farmer and their entire bloodline's livelihood for generations to come. Just leave a Yelp review, man. Unsurprisingly, Europe has also been quick to add stricter rules that increase obligations on farms to reduce industrial emissions. And people are getting upset with the rules. One Italian protester told the Daily Mail, "Europe imposes rules on us that make no sense. We can no longer make a living. We want to make more money and have our products valued for what they are." European elites claim that they're making food supply chains resilient by making them sustainable through environmentally friendly frameworks like the European Green Deal's farm-to-fork strategy. But according to the US Department of Agriculture, Europe's policies might lead to reduced productivity, higher food prices, and further global food insecurity if implemented. Not exactly something I'd consider sustainable. It's pretty insane to see European leaders attacking their own food chains. This goes against everything I learned playing real-time strategies, and is straight up World Economic Forum levels of crazy, which European leaders aren't strangers of. Even from an environmentally conscious point of view, it's really hard to see if this makes sense. Think about it. They're making their measure of success depend on local greenhouse emissions. But if they're pushing for more global products from places with many less environmental regulations, like meat from Latin America, how exactly is that going to help the supposed global climate crisis? What good is having low emissions locally if you're creating more elsewhere? Although I guess it does technically help reduce carbon footprints if millions end up starving to death. But by that logic, you could say Pol Pot was one of the greatest environmentalists in history. It's funny to see how a lot of left-leaning elites, especially the mainstream media, are quick to connect legitimate farmer protests to the quote-unquote far right. and how far-right politicians and parties are going to capitalize on farmers' grievances. Well, I guess needing to, eat is a pretty old-fashioned conservative idea. The mainstream media, whether it's American or European, loves scaring people with the far-right label.
Leaders will have to work on a more convincing set of measures to avoid growing support for the far right ahead of the European parliamentary elections in June.
People these days keep saying far-right so many times, I don't even know what it means anymore. But who cares about definitions? Labeling people you don't like as far-right is the go-to strategy for politicians and the mainstream media to demonize people. So why are so many people quick to connect the far-right to farmer protests? Perhaps it's because the European parliamentary election is coming up later this year, and elites are afraid of losing seats to people who don't think like them. Or it could be how progressives try to frame the backlash against Europe's green initiatives to democratic backsliding, which is when a country moves from democracy towards authoritarianism. But if you ask me, we should be more concerned about the opposite: climate activism leading to democratic backsliding. If wanting to change what people eat isn't evidence enough, the fact that you have people questioning if democracy and climate mitigation are incompatible should definitely frighten you. After all, according to this horrifying article, democracy works by compromise, but climate change is precisely the type of problem that seems not to allow for it. Which is scary, because all you have to do is cite climate change to shut down discussion. Remember that the next time you're having a fight with your girlfriend or wife. Tell her she's releasing too much hot air into the atmosphere. She'll really appreciate that. Now, to get around controversial topics YouTube doesn't want us talking about, I've created a new show called Deep Thoughts While Gaming to hide those discussions in gaming content. Curious? Well, then why don't you click on this video? It's all about curiosity. Go on, click. Curiosity never killed the cat. And hit that orange button to support the show on Patreon. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.